Welcome back, everyone. How was the circle? What were some big takeaways? I'm curious. Or is it a private circle that you can't talk about it?
Somebody in our group was talking about how the concept of land back doesn't actually have to be this really complicated concept, that it can just actually be land back.
Yep. Absolutely. That's something that, we've spent time, and you'll hear today too, that concept of land. And actually, that's a nice little segue to this part as we're continuing to hear more. Right in front of you, on the table, there's some sticky notes. And just what you said too, right? This idea that it doesn't have to be that complicated. We really love for all of you to take some time. As one of the questions we asked you when you all left was to think through that a little bit, especially within that circle. Like, what does land back actually mean to you? So we, as we're I'd love to hear some more from some more folks, but maybe spend some time too writing down words or any sort of thought that popped up. That would be great. Anyone else?
I have something to add. I guess I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and in Southeast Louisiana, we're losing land rapidly, and so the land is kind of is disappearing. And I guess in my lifetime, where I'm coming from, it will eventually go under. So this idea of land back, like thinking about also like the permanence of the land that's where I'm on right now, and climate change, and how it's kind of an urgency.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I know elements of environmentalism and climate change come in through all the work that, all of you do too as well. Well, how about then let's just take some time answering that question. What does land back actually mean to you? What are some thoughts that emerged as you were sort of thinking through that?
Should we call on people?
I'll jump in. I'm one of those folks who feels like it's really just not that complicated. And so I live in the West, and there's lots of land that's held in public trust. So one of my thoughts, and that's not really my thought, other brilliant people, but like the land that's held in trust by the government, just like giving it back. And that's easy. Like tribes can take that and steward it as we've been doing since time immemorial. So there's a really easy way to start that process.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That answer is that like it's basic, right? Like at its most simplest. But then that's then the issue, right? That idea of it's not that simple, and we want it, so desperately to be, but and those are exactly some of those struggles you'll hear everyone talking about. Like land back is so much more. There's so much bureaucracy and procedure and policy to it.
So just building on that, so are they like the little half sheets that you guys have on your tables where you can, maybe, so, Stephanie, when you were talking about there's land held in public trust, was like federal land, right? So to me, the word that kind of pops out to me is like a lot of times when people think about land back, it's like a federal kind of issue, federal and tribes, tribes being federally recognized sovereign nations. And so I think that concept that you just brought up is kind of like where a lot of the thinking kind of when we talk about land back floats in that area without people really like pulling that word out, that federal and sovereignty relationship. So, those kinds of words you can write on your little half sheets. When you think about like, what does land back mean? Does it mean to tribes, federally recognized tribes? Does it mean something that the federal government does? Those types of words, because we're going to make us a word cloud out of this. And we want to kind of see, before we have this conversation, what are the themes, I guess, or words or concepts that you're thinking about when you think about land back, right now, and how maybe will that change after we have these conversations?
And also some of it is really, I mean, if you're thinking about your institution, where you're working at, land back to me means you are, and there's so many different, right? But okay, you're respecting tribal sovereignty, land back, you're working with tribal nations. But for some institutions, the answer could be, I have no clue. Like, I want to understand what that means. I believe I know what it means, but how do I engage in that? Where do I start? So even those sort of really, places where you're just thinking through it, wanting to think through it, anything that you have, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, just a couple more and then we'll jump right in.
Another maybe touched on a little bit, but just even backing up the idea of ownership, and this also makes me think about one time at NHS, we had someone come and just really describe in detail the surveying process of Minnesota, the initial surveying, and how that's such a, it's something any of us hardly ever think about. Maybe if you go back and look at your abstract of your property or something, but just that process and the concept of ownership. And then another one, second, the simplicity of land back, but also culture and things that museums are holding that belong to others that should also be given back.
Yeah, absolutely right. Beyond the land, like what is it? Beyond the land, what else does that mean? What's included? Kevin, I know you have, we can do both. Go ahead.
I'd say it's a cultural necessity, especially for our youth. If they don't have that land to learn from, then that culture begins to die. I would say it's a necessity of keeping, who we are, who we are. I don't know if I answered your question.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely, no, thank you. Kevin?
I think within this room and maybe this convening, we want it to be very simple, but we can't ignore how power is held and the role that racism plays and how that power is utilized.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the experiences and the narratives you're going to hear today, you're going to see that theme play throughout. Yeah.
Whether it's like a federal thing, who's doing this, whether it's the trusts that hold land, something that we see in Alaska is some of this happening from like a corporate place, which we have a lot of mining, and it's everything in Alaska is gold, coal, or oil, and but the mines themselves then paying for work to be done for mine reclamation and then that being returned, but it's being returned stripped, and they're doing everything that the engineers are telling them to get it back to an okay place before it's returned, but it's not ever going to be an okay environment again. But
Absolutely.
that's another partner layer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It has a kind of quality of righting a wrong, or a reparative quality, or restorative quality.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm also thinking about land back without the small print. We understand sometimes land as just the surface, but it goes beyond that below. And so I think there has been a lot of past mistrust and purposeful sort of hidden agendas with taking of land, and then still having access to the mining of it, and so I'm thinking of land back, true land back, everything.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into introducing the next speakers, because the experience that you're going to hear now is about Right, exactly that. The Minnesota Historical Society, this colonial institution. We have 26 historic sites, around the state, but we're also really rooted deeply, right, in these sort of different notions of settler colonialism and white supremacy. And we've worked throughout all of these decades in so many different ways to work on partnerships to heal the harm. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenters. Cheyenne, I'll start right here.
Good afternoon. My name is Cheyenne St. John. I work as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer at Chashayapi, also known as Lower Sioux. We have a presentation and kind of an overview of our process that we undertook. It was finalized in 2022, our land back, 2021, sorry, COVID. And what I wanted to share about that experience is the complexity of it, but also some of the challenges and the successes of it. I know that a lot of folks are here from outside of Minnesota, so before we get started, I just wanted to kind of describe where we are located. So we're in the southwest portion of the state of Minnesota. The Lower Sioux Agency Historic Site is about 240 acres of historic and cultural corridor. And it is one of the sites that was managed by one of the 26 that was managed by the Minnesota Historical Society. I believe the state of Minnesota took that, or the state of Minnesota became an owner of that land in 1967, and it was designated as a state historic property later within a few years. But the Lower Sioux Agency has a really deep history within our Dakota community, within our Dakota history and narrative. This was the site where the U.S.-Dakota War broke out. In addition, and that was in 1862. But in addition to that, this was the ancestral territories of our Dakota ancestors and relatives. And so I just wanted to kind of orient you to place and provide a little bit of history about that. The state of Minnesota in 1967 conducted some archaeology. It was designated as a state historic property. Shortly after, in the 70s, I believe an interpretive center was built there that had exhibits and content, and trails were developed throughout the site. And the Historical Society managed that over the years. One of the things that I wanted to share is that this site this land transfer was one of the first that was undertaken between the tribe and the state within Minnesota. So this was really a precedent, a milestone that was set. And just listening to some of the feedback about the concept seeming so simple, this actually started in conversations about transferring the land. Started in 2003. So I mentioned that the transfer was finalized in 2021. So it was almost 20 years before we got to the point where we received the land back. And I had mentioned to our group earlier that as far as land back goes, it's one of those kind of like terms that can mean so many things. It's a loaded term. And in the cultural resource arena, I think we kind of speak our own language sometimes, where we just assume maybe others are sharing that interpretation or that assumption of meaning. And this is one of the terms where I began to learn that what the tribe views as land back is not always what the institution views as land back, or an organization views as land back. That could be the concept itself as well as the process. So for Lower Sioux, one of the perspectives that was very prevalent as far as recognizing the land transfer or land back was that this meant reclamation. This was a reclamation of our land back to the original owners. And so when we think about that term, it's also important to recognize that this is a trending movement and that some of the grassroots, like the origination of this, came from Rapid City and Rapid City, South Dakota, a nonprofit out there. And, their interpretation of land back is very different than maybe how we as partners, as tribes see that. So, there's all these ideas about what it means, what it looks like, and how the process goes. So I think it was important for you guys as an audience to know that at Lower Sioux, that is how we interpreted it, is a reclamation of land. So the map here kind of identifies those boundaries that I mentioned, the 240 acres of historic corridor and the land that was transferred back. So in addition to this being a milestone, it was complex because it wasn't just state land. Like some of the other transfers that are happening in the state of Minnesota, it's a return of state park land or forestry land. At Lower Sioux, this was state land between the Minnesota Historical Society. Some parcels were DNR, and then you got our tribal boundaries that abut to those areas. So each situation is very unique when you talk about these processes. And for Lower Sioux, those were some things that just distinguished us. I won't say they served as barriers or challenges, but it's just some of the distinguishing factors of our process. The Lower Sioux Agency entered into a partnership with the Minnesota Historical Society in 2007, I believe, right, Ben? Was it 9 or 7? 2009. Yeah, 2009. So what that meant is that the Lower Sioux Indian community shared in the management and the operation liability of this site. So this is an image of the historic site as you enter. One of the things that really prompted this partnership was some actions that were happening within the state prior to 2009. So I think there were some budget cuts, and the operations of this site weren't, at least through the tribe's eyes, being considered a priority, and they were talking about shutting down the site. And that's when the tribe, I think it was in 2003 or 2004, donated $80,000 to the Minnesota Historical Society to make sure that the site remained operational. Once that donation was given, I believe conversations started about the partnership agreement, which was then executed that following year in 2009. So now the tribe at that time became a partner in the operations and management of it. And we have been successfully doing so since that time. I know that we talked about the land being transferred or finalized in 2021. With the exception of that building that is in the photograph, a lot of the land has been returned back. In 2021, of those 240 acres, about 120 were transferred back to Lower Sioux Indian community. And there are continued conversations for additional parcels within that map boundary to be coming back to the tribe this year or next year. So. But through our partnership agreement, we were able to really enhance the narrative, the Dakota narrative, how we talked about our history, provide cultural education, and just have a larger presence in the site. So on the left, you'll see, that the signage didn't really represent any presence of a tribal entity. And this picture on the right is a part of some of the rebranding efforts that we took once that transfer or that reclamation was completed. So you have our tribal logo, you have us identified as a partner, in addition to just the entry signs. All of our trail signs on site include the presence of Dakota language and phrases, Dakota place names, and just a more inclusive narrative of Dakota history and truth telling. One of the things, before I get too far ahead of myself, that I'll share is, having worked through this process with the tribe, there were some real hard truths that surfaced in the midst of the process, because of the uniqueness of this land transfer. We really found out who our allies and our partners were and where they were at in their relationship with us. So, for example, I had mentioned that in 2003 is when these conversations about the land being returned to the tribe started. Over a series of years, there were documents drafted, additional dialogue, and what ended up happening was in 2004, right before the agreement to transfer the land to the tribe was executed, there was a contingency in the agreement that would allow our county, Redwood County, to veto the power over the deal. And so it was brought to the Paxton Township Board for their approval, and it was vetoed 4-1. So at that time, we learned that our community, our non-Native community and neighbors, may not share their excitement about what we're trying to do here. But it's through processes like this where some of those biases, prejudices, racism, really come out. It's systematic, and so keeping that in mind as you think about some of your actions and where you're coming from as an institution is it was through processes like this that we learned who our allies were. So let's see. Yeah, and then okay. So what has been really great about our partnership agreement and things that have happened since 2021 is we've been able to be more inclusive in our storytelling, our interpretations, our programming, but mainly how we steward the land. So integrating more of our traditional ecological knowledge there, sharing some of our worldviews, our culture, our history at the site, and then most importantly, allowing community to reconnect to that landscape. I'm going to kind of pass this off to to Ben here. Ben's gonna maybe talk a little bit from the organizational perspective about their experience too with that.
Thank you very much. I have a lot of notes, and having a conversation with me is like having a 4-year-old tell you a joke. There's no real semblance or order, and you have to tell when it's over. So apologies. But the Minnesota Historical Society will be 175 years old in September. We're a quasi-state agency, and state statute designates the Minnesota Historical Society as the steward of state historic sites. So there aren't state historic sites within like state parks or anything like that. It is the Minnesota Historical Society, but also acknowledges that we can form partnerships with tribes, with cities, with organizations to operate those state historic sites. So as Cheyenne said, Lower Sioux Agency is a really good example of that complexity. There's state property, there's Minnesota Historical Society property, and now there is community property as well. So just a lot of things to navigate. I say that that process was where I learned to stop saying this shouldn't take too long at work, because it was just incredibly complex and took a very long time. This spanned tribal council members, it spanned MNHS executive directors, it spanned staff. I worked a lot on the project and then was taken off the project and then came back to the project. And I think for me, the key takeaway here, and I'll mention it now and I'll come back to it, and we'll come back to it a lot. There's lots of regulatory things and there's lots of hoops to jump through, and those aren't always fair or equitable or in the best interest of anyone. But really what I want people to leave this session with is that none of this is possible without relationships and without trust. It's long, it's arduous, it's complicated, it's emotional, it's frustrating. It's great at the end. The finish line's awesome. But relationships are strong when they're multifaceted. This wasn't just our executive director and President Larson. This is a lot of folks. And when stuff goes wrong, because when stuff will go wrong, I think, and I give the tribe all of the credit, but they were able to say, yeah, this person's having an off day, or it's this person, not the organization, or it's this thing that happened that nobody could control and we can get through this. Without it, it would have been really hard to go on this 4-year process. There were lots of times when this probably shouldn't have worked because from my perspective, the community should have just said, you know what, we're not going to do this. This is too painful. We're just going to walk away. And they didn't, and we didn't. And, because we had strong relationships, because we had trust, because we had consensus around what the expectations were and what the finish line is. And there's no substitute for that. And every transfer, every land back, every partnership is going to have different hurdles and different expectations and different strengths and weaknesses. And so I think we can talk about the complexity for complexity's sake, but it really depends on your specific situation or your specific objectives for what you're trying to get at. But the one universal thing is that relationship. So, like I said, Lower Sioux has a mix of ownership, and that meant that processes that we had to go through to navigate a transfer. LawCon, Land and Water Conservation Act. This was LawCon property. There was a federal 106 process. There was a legislative process. There was a 138, which is shorthand for the statutes in Minnesota that talk about historic preservation and historic sites. There was a 138 process. This was bonded property, part of it. It involved the Lower Sioux community, tribal council and community, the Minnesota Historical Society staff and board, the state legislature, the State Historic Preservation Office, the National Park Service, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That's a lot of red tape and a lot of different people and a lot of conversations and a lot of forms. And again, every process is different, but I think to go back from an organizational standpoint before I close, prior to all this was a real shift in attitude, maybe isn't the right word, but a real shift in how the Minnesota Historical Society sees itself. If you go back 175 years or 50 years or even 25 years, I think we kind of felt like the arbiter of history in Minnesota a little bit, and that it was our responsibility, but also to be good history really meant that the Minnesota Historical Society had to do it, right? There are state historic sites because this place is important and the Minnesota Historical Society should take care of it. And I think, thankfully, in my career, we are evolving and we are changing, and we are recognizing that we are not the sole arbiter of history in Minnesota. And sometimes we are not the best arbiter of history in Minnesota. And I think that this partnership and this co-ownership and this effort really exemplifies that. The Minnesota Historical Society recognizes that the Lower Sioux community is the best steward of the Lower Sioux Agency. This is community history. This place will be better preserved, it will be better operated, it will be better interpreted with the community doing that. And that doesn't mean that the Minnesota Historical Society wants to walk away from that. And I think that's what's really unique about our partnership. We co-own this site. There are partnership funds that help resource the telling of this site. The community is putting a lot of money into it too, for sure. And the public benefits from that. This is a better place to visit. It's better preserved. It's going to be taken care of better with the community doing it. And this wasn't about let us transfer this property so that the Minnesota Historical Society doesn't have anything to do with this place anymore. And it's not. It is a real shared mission and shared purpose of continuing to use this place and welcome people to this place to teach them about history and to teach them about the community. And that's just very exciting. This relationship is one of the best parts of my entire museum career. So, John?
Holy cow. Hello, my name's John Robertson, and I am the site manager at this place that we've been showing on here. And I began in 2021, and so I swore I'd never talk about it in this way, but COVID. So I retired just prior to COVID, and I had all these plans and all this kind of stuff, and then of course then COVID hits, and so then it gave me a chance to rethink everything. And I'm really happy for that, actually, because I didn't start my consulting firm that I was going to do in retirement. I didn't do any of that kind of stuff, and I found out what I really wanted to do. See, so then COVID starts breaking, and this land, the actual official thing of the land transfer begins or happens in February of 2021, and so that is still lockdown. And I think there was like 5 people there. At the actual transfer back with the signing thing.
We were very well spaced, but there were a lot of people there.
Right, and so, but see, I wasn't even, because I didn't start work until July. I was hired in July. When the site started reopening in Minnesota, and it was a perfect job. It was 3 days a week, 6 months out of the year. I didn't have to work. And for people who know me, that's perfect, because I hate work. And so I get hired to do this, and the first thing I walk into then was, oh, that map. If you go back to that map, see, we've got trails all through here. And there's all kinds of stuff that's going on, and of course, you know, when you get a new manager, for those of you that are bosses, you know, we got all kinds of ideas, you know. We're in charge now, you know. We don't care what your mission was. We got a new mission, and so. But if you look, if there's trails that go through there, and so if you look at that blue triangle that comes up and hits the county road, there is that. So you walk from the facility to the warehouse, which is a big deal on this site, and so you walk through there, and you would go through 3 different landowners. And then when you start looking, see those trees that are in the aerial shot there, and then there's way more on the east side there where it says Track C boundary that they are got all overgrown with trees. And so Ben comes out for the first time to do his thing for his official visit, you know, For those of you that work at places, you have an overriding agency sometimes, then they come and do site visits. Well, he has to do one every 3 years to each site. And so he shows up, I'm new, and so we go for a walk, and I say, I'd really like to burn this prairie to bring it back. And I said, but who's in charge of burning? Because you got the BIA, you got DNR, and then a quasi-state owner in the Historical Society. And I'm going, but the grass doesn't care where it's growing, and if we're going to burn it, who's in charge? So those are my kinds of questions. And see, this other side then is that I came out of a whole different field. I have no knowledge of museums, no knowledge of this kind of stuff. And I went to my first museum convention, which was really fun. It was archivists and museum operator, and what's the other one? Archivist? Anyway, librarians. See, and so for somebody like me, that was like throwing me back into high school where you couldn't chew gum in the library. And so I had to learn all this new language, and I'm still learning it. But the common denominator is that I come out of working with institutional racism all my life. See? And the power and the impact that has on how people operate. And so that is an underlying thing for me as a site manager now, is that, and I find that part of what I keep, one of the things that surprises me because I come out of the Native community is that I forget that I'm the minor player. And that the power lies in that racism, which affects every day what we do, and how then we tell the story to visitors. And the impact of that, even though we're operational and we're managing, and I don't work for the Historical Society, I work for the tribe, all these things have changed, is that we still interface with that larger public that comes, they don't, and most people don't realize that they come in representing that institutional racism, and they carry it. And so when we're looking at these kinds of processes, and when you're looking at land back, is that I like the idea that came up of restoration. Whoever mentioned that word. But see again that it's the physical restoration, it's a theoretical restoration, it's a philosophical restoration, and a spiritual restoration. And so that means, like what Ben was saying, is that it is more than you can start out, and we have to deal with the institutional stuff because that is the world we live in. But what we need to remember is that we're not going to get to all those levels of restoration if we do not have relationships, and true relationships. And even in like that thing over there, I've been reading at the Museums Advancing Racial Justice Values, is that until we can get rid of the word groups or them and us, we're not there. Because we still haven't gotten to the point where we're in the philosophical, spiritual aspect of it. And so when the slant back comes back, is that again, as a site manager and as a person that is actually then dealing with the aspect of it, is that we have people still challenging why we got the land back. And we have people writing us letters, sending us emails, making telephone calls, leaving messages to this day, is that expressing what we need to as a whole society, a whole culture, a whole whatever you want, however you want to break it down, is that we need to start dealing with and understanding the depth of the racism that exists within our own institutions, even though we're so cool. But so what I was supposed to talk about was the interface of what goes on, and see but that's still driving it. And that's kind of the core of what this whole convening is about, is that understanding and coming to grips with how do we deal with the racial injustice, and to come to realize that it is multicolored. It's not, especially those that come from urban areas away from rural Minnesota that has a whole bunch of Indians running around in it, it's beyond that racism that you experience in the urban areas. So I don't know. That's my institutional manifestation of land back is what my title was. Actually, within the 30 to, we're down to 30 days about, and we get to do it. Or at least part of it, because the BIA is going to be in charge.
And one word I kind of want to use to kind of describe this process, at least from the perspective from archaeology and institutions, is kind of a regeneration. And this is kind of how I view it. This is how I view the archaeology. So for background, for archaeology, for me, it's a very interdisciplinary science. We are not a group that stands alone. We take all different types of worldviews. We want to come to a universal understanding. And even so, my perspective on this is always kind of environmental landscape archaeology. Every single sand grain that we're moving, in the dirt, if we're excavating and so forth, has a purpose, is live, the land is alive and is a being. And this is a process that we kind of interpret. And, the meaning behind the land back and so forth for us is really kind of a regeneration. Like John, I started right at COVID. I think my first day was March 16th, 2020. And so I came in, at the later half of this work. But one of the things that, we really started looking at, and, a lot of it was with the help of a lot of awesome colleagues. Some of them we have here, Ben, Nicole, Dr. Bean, all kind of helped, kind of transform this process. But one of the things that we had to do is look at our own history and look at our own institutional and really understand why, why we have Historic Sites Network. What are we trying to communicate here? And when you start looking at this, and this story is kind of across the whole 26 site network that we have, right? 26? Yeah, it's 26. Is that you start looking at it, since we only tell at that, through a lot of our history, we only told one story at that time. What a lot of people don't know, prior to this work happening, is that the Lower Sioux Agency, that whole entire landscape has been used and honored for over 10,000, maybe 13,000, who knows, how early. And that was the whole thing that we wanted to make sure we communicate. This is a similar story that you go across our whole entire sites network. If you go to our historic Fort Snelling, if you go to the Lindbergh House, if you go to Snake River, we have the same story over and over again. But when you go to those sites, you're telling one story. And so that is something, when Ben was talking about how we evolve through a historic sites network, that's something to always kind of keep in mind whenever we're working through these types of, this type of work, is to make sure that we're acknowledging that and really diving into our institution and our institutional history to really understand, but also kind of break down those barriers of like, hey, does this few month story really outweigh what's happening across the landscape? So that's one thing. It's, really definitely diving into kind of what the institution is, whether it is MHS or if we're doing it in partnership with with the state of Minnesota, or any other agencies or any other land management groups, is to really kind of diving into that institutional history.
Thanks, Jen. So one of the major successes that we've been able to really realize is our ability to now steward the landscape that was reclaimed from the Minnesota Historical Society. And as John kind of mentioned, a lot of that was already happening through our partnership agreement. One of the key pieces of interpretation that we try to share, especially around this idea of the land transfer and land back, is our Dakota worldview or philosophy about the land. We understand and acknowledge the connections that exist beyond just the landscape. It's the elements. It's the elements, the resources, our winged relatives, our four-legged relatives, all of that is a part of a symbiosis that is connected and that we acknowledge and try to respect. And then balancing all of those approaches and I guess approaches on the landscape to kind of continue the healing that needs to take place on that landscape. Those are a lot of factors to balance. And it's not to say that, I guess the better way to say it is that those are things that we have always been doing. No matter who owned it, we were stewarding this landscape before and during and even after the Historical Society land transfer. So just trying to share that with the audience when they come to the site, that we have that deeper, richer understanding of connections, not just here at the agency, but throughout our community, throughout the state. This is a part of our worldview. And so the picture on the left identifies like our garden area. One of the really exciting things that we've been working on the last couple of years is the interpretation. So some of those more traditional like garden techniques that were historically used in our communities and villages are re-implemented on site, and then of course that history shared with our audiences. But we also we work with a lot of youth, and we try to bring them onto the site to understand more of the traditional ecological knowledge that is used to work with the landscape. And that really is, I think one of the things that John and I have agreed upon and discussed is that we are working with our landscape, not over it, not on it, not against it. We're not trying to control it. And since the land transfer has happened, there are some new approaches, maintenance and landscape approaches that we've implemented. In the picture that I showed you earlier, you might have noticed that on the left side here, you can see that the site's very mowed, manicured, cut back. And this photo that was taken on the right last year, you see some of the prairie grasses coming back, and I'm kind of doing a lot of prairie restoration and landscape restoration. And for me, who's been out there 10 years and used to seeing it look like a golf course, it's really hard sometimes to see like, we should be mowing that. But, this is a part of the traditional knowledge that we're trying to implement on the landscape, is letting things just like heal, come back in their natural forms, and trying to share that beauty with our audiences that come through the site, that aesthetically, it may not be the most pleasing, but this is how things were done, working in balance with the landscape. So Yeah, and we're through my office, the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, we've been able to implement some of the landscape maintenance protocols. We have tribal laws that govern how we work with our tribal lands. And so, yeah, that's part of the work that we do in my office. And really happy that we have the Lower Sioux Agency now as part of those parcels to include under our tribal laws.
Yeah, Amber, can we watch that video to kind of close it out?
No, we still want to. I mean, there's some. I mean, I think
All right,
we're here until 12:30, correct? Yeah, and so we've got a little time. And I'd like you to, to finish some of those approaches, and then we'll end with that video. If that's, I mean, because if we start right, if we got about 5 minutes, I think we're good. Okay.
I finished it.
Oh, what am I talking about?
We're
Ask questions.
if not,
You have a question?
I'm Aaron. I'm Yupik and I work for the Brick Museum. I'm also a tribal lawyer's son, so this is very impressive to me to see you go through all of those things. That's quite an accomplishment. I was curious about, back in 2003 when this conversation first started, if the tribe reached out to the Minnesota Historical Society, if it happened the other way, and how that initial conversation might have or might have not influenced the process.
I think we're dealing with a little bit of lack of institutional memory, and none of us were in those original conversations. But I think it was the community reaching out to the Historical Society, and I always, across our site's network, if a community expresses interest in telling their own story, and perhaps all the way from that could be a single program to a partnership to shared ownership to total ownership. I think that those are conversations that we want to have. Our institutional memory is sitting in the back. So Kevin, if you want to.
Yeah, 20 years ago and 20 pounds ago, I helped develop the exhibit that is currently at that site. And there was a lot of collaboration with all 4 of the Dakota communities in that exhibit collaboration. We've also had an Indian Advisory Council since the late 1980s with representation from the tribe. So there were all sorts of connections that existed. And I think that redevelopment of the site in 2002, 2003 is when I think we started looking at bigger possibilities.
And even though in this role I wasn't there, I hitchhiked through in 1977 because my great-great-grandfather is buried on the site. He married actually one of Cheyenne's relatives way back then. And so I knew he was buried there. I was hitchhiking through, got stranded, went up on the hill, and actually the museum itself, the building of the museum had just opened up. And the manager there at the time had a conversation with me that we continued out over the years, where he recognized, I believe, Tom Allig, recognized early on that the institution was not telling the story. And I don't know how he got there. I don't know what he did, but I over the years had an ongoing relationship with him. So I know it started when they redid the stuff in the 90s. I think it was that there was an actual conversation with the tribe and the historic site to transfer the land back. So it's been going on even before the 2003 era. Where things have been going on. So again, this is an unofficial kind of part of the conversation.
Yeah, I just wanted to share one more story because it's one of the most powerful moments for me in this process. And you mentioned your parent is a tribal lawyer, and we were meeting to keep this process going, and we were meeting at the visitor center, and there was a break, and so we were just sort of taking 5 and walking around, and was looking at the exhibit, and one of the tribal lawyers for the community came up to me, and I was looking at a photo that's in the exhibit that's from the early 1940s of two girls and a dog sitting on some steps in the community. And she pointed at it, she said, "That's my mom." And that just, I think, illustrates how close the community is to this whole process and to the site. And I think I'll always remember that.
Oh, so then what we have up here just before we get to the video is that when you're talking about land acknowledgements and things like that, is that this is actually this is our land, what they call our Aboriginal title lands. And so what people don't remember, what we need to remember, it's a whole big long thing. Go back and read the history of Europe and how modern law develops, blah, blah. Nation states. Nation states have boundaries. We didn't have, this is our territory. I know that some people who are tribal will start yelling at me, well, this is our territory, blah, blah, blah. No, we had common use areas, and where we are, the area that your language and your culture had major influence, and others would come in when they got to the point where their language, their culture no longer existed, then that was your territory. And so this was the Dakota Cheti Shikoi, which means that this was all 7 bands, all 7 members of the community, and our influence. And I would say that this was around the 1300 era that we have some on the site. We have some archaic sites, and archaeological sites, and I would say that that would represent our territory at that time. And so the people that now, and this causes a problem for those of you that are involved with NEGPRA, and those of you that are involved in other things. You wondered how I was going to get that in, didn't you? But this is an issue. And for land acknowledgement statements. The complexity of it, because now, according to NEGPRA maps and things like that, that's not what it looks like. So anyway, so they wanted me to get that in, and I did, and I got my dig in on NEGPRA. So.
Should we just, yeah. All right. We're going to wrap it up with a video. It's 2 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to Wakantipi folks. This video that we're going to share is a couple of minutes. You're going to hear from President Robert Larson, chairman of the Lower Sioux Indian community, on the meaning behind the return of this land. And as you've heard, from everyone, that it's so much more, right, than that. It's about memory and spirits and ceremonies and places where your ancestors are buried and how you steward the land, and the return and the transfer and all of that healing, right?
So this video was created in partnership with our friends at Hamline University Center for Global and Environmental Education. I like to tell Ben that's my favorite video that we have because it highlights me prominently. Honestly, I hope you all get a little bit of a sense of the site that we're working in. It's in the urban core, surrounded by railroad. I mean, you could kind of see that in the video. There's a railroad, there's a highway that goes right through there, another bridge that kind of spans over the site. It's right on the river. And the 2 kind of key features of this sacred place are the burial mounds and the sacred cave site. This is who we are, Wakantipi, Wayankapi. Wakantipi is the site. Wayankapi means the ones who care for this place. That's who we are. Our mission is to engage people to honor and care for our natural places and the sacred sites and cultural values within them. And we do that work here at the site. So these are just some images of the site itself, and then the ways that we engage community in education and learning and land stewardship at this place. And a lot of the work that we're doing is place-based, which is challenging to do when we don't have a kind of home base to do that from. So one of our biggest projects right now is developing an interpretive center where we can kind of have that home base, have our offices, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Just want to go to the next one. And then I'm going to turn it over to Sam, and he can talk a little bit about this kind of like constellation of other project sites. Place-based.
Hello, everyone. So Walk on Teepee is the larger red dot in the center on the right, and this is a map of the Twin Cities, so Minneapolis and St. Paul, without Minneapolis and St. Paul. And you can really start to see the importance of the rivers and the lakes and the relationship between all of these Dakota important sites. All of these words here are just recent efforts of many efforts of doing place-based design to relate to the cultural identity of Dakota people and really to try to reconnect culture to the landscape places, the ceremonial places, the cultural, the historical sites in the Twin Cities area, but to do it in a contemporary way, to think about not a building or an interpretive center as a museum where you go and learn about the past, but Walk on Teepee was always envisioned as a place where culture happens. It's a living culture that you're not going to go see there a display in a box, but you're really going to see the activities happening in real time. So just having this relationship between all of these different institutions is important because even though each of these has its own separate identity as a place, there's a relationship between this whole area as being Dakota homelands. And so, and I didn't know you guys were going to have this map, but I have a very similar map of the fact that the relationship between people, culture is much more complex than just reservation system today or what we own today. So the ideas of land and connections to those cultural ownership of it versus legal ownership from a kind of colonial perspective, they're all important things to consider. And if you look at the entire nation and in that context of what has been lost from a reservation standpoint, it really starts to put that into perspective. So when we get to our actual site, we're in a very contemporary modern city, and so we're part of what's called Indian Mounds Park. One of the most important things is that it's really not a park, it's a cemetery. And so that's one of the efforts we're doing here of just changing the language, and that language helps change your perception of what it is. I remember at Indian Mounds Park being, growing up in the Twin Cities, having a field trip there. And I remember all the kids got off the bus and there were trails up and down and we were running up and down the mounds, not knowing that. And this me as an indigenous person, we were just told that this is a place to play and people would walk their dogs and I'm sure their dogs would crap on the mounds and all that stuff. So all that happened, but without the work of the Dakota community to change that was always going to have this different perception. You can see we're in a very modern context, but we're trying to create this relationship between all these sites that we know about. And I'm going to come back to St. Paul. The area on the right where the maps are designated, it doesn't show the erasure of all of the other sacred sites that are there. So don't be fooled by any kind of map like this that shows this is where the mounds were, because they were all over the place and settlements and ties to the landscape. But it just happens that here's where they weren't completely decimated. And there are much of that park was leveled out flat, and the mounds were, things were stolen from them. So now, fast forward with Walk on Teepee and Maggie's group and their efforts at thinking about this site from a Dakota perspective. How would we think about land use and designing a building? And that's where I came in. And so I'm an architect, and I'm Ojibwe, so I have to admit that. So, but I work all over the country working with different tribes, and what I try to do is help each community design for itself and let them be the authorship of design. When we started looking at this site, and we're in a nature sanctuary, the idea is first of all, where do you site the building? The issues are, what does it look like? What is its expression? So our process had to do with just really, first of all, understanding the site. And if you want to talk a little bit about the history.
Yeah, so the history of this place, and I kind of talked a little bit in the video, but it was very, very, very quiet video. So I'll just kind of recap a little bit. But the history of this place is a place of ceremony, a place of burial, where our relatives were laid to rest. Like Sam was saying, at the top of the bluff, there are only a handful. There are 6 remaining mounds that are intact. Not to say that none of them were, that there wasn't looting in those 6, because there was, but there are still burial remains in those 6 today. So, but there were dozens and dozens of burial mounds atop that bluff that were leveled or filled over to create St. Paul, the city of St. Paul's first park, Indian Mounds Regional Park. And there would be picnics, and it was treated like a park. And so that's the history of where the burials were. But then down below, where the cave was and the ceremonies and other things, those were the types of activities that Dakota people would come to this site for from hundreds of miles around. Dakota communities it was a pilgrimage place. So you would come here to do certain activities and do certain ceremonies and certain things at certain times of the year. And so kind of our goal when we started working with this site was to restore the honor to this place that it deserves, to restore access for Native people to be able to come to this place to pray, to leave offerings, and that in and of itself is a process with a lot of policy work that has to happen, because this site is now owned by the city of St. Paul. Prior to that, you can see that some of those images on the bottom of the railroad, and there we go. Okay, so I'm jumping around a little bit. I was telling my colleagues I'm a little bit off today, so my apologies. But this was a sacred place, and then in a nutshell, in the mid to late 1800s, Dakota people were exiled from the state of Minnesota after the U.S.-Dakota War, and after that separation, traumatic separation from place, these types of things started happening. Industry came in. The site was really destroyed, not entirely, but it was very heavily damaged due to all of the industry. It was a rail yard for about 100 years. There were other industries down there, breweries. There was a manufactured gas plant on the site. There was milling activities at the site, all kinds of things like that. Ultimately, in the late 90s, early 2000s, a neighborhood group came together to restore the land. After the railroad had kind of abandoned the site, they had got all the use out of it that they could. It became an informal city dump. There was all kinds of big items that people didn't want to properly dispose of. So refrigerators, old cars, couches, tires, things like that, just dumped down at this site. Meanwhile, I should say, Dakota people and families were still going to this place during that time, leaving offerings and praying. So it was not lost; it was interrupted, and there are families that held on to that connection. Those activities continued to take place even during this time. So I want to say that. But this neighborhood group came together of non-Native people and wanted to restore the site, reclaim it, clean it up. And so that's the kind of origins of our organization now. Wakantipi Wayankapi started as a smaller neighborhood group called Lower Phelan Creek Project. And They raised some money. They worked with the Trust for Public Land, got the land transferred to the city for public use, and then started a restoration project. Well, federal funds were used to do that restoration project, and that required a 106 consultation with tribes. And that is when the cultural significance of this site was learned by the group of people who were working on the project. So I don't know what the next slide has. Does it have some of the pictures of the rest? This is the site now. So the community worked with the tribes. The decision, and there were a lot of ideas from the local community on the east side of St. Paul at the time about what to do with this site. Soccer field was a big one. Dog park was another one. But it's a cultural site, so ultimately the group decided to work with the tribes, restore the land to as much of a native landscape. And Nicole was talking about this a little bit earlier this morning, looking back at those surveys, those original land surveys prior to colonization, what was this land like prior to that, and restoring those species here. So that was the original restoration of the site. And then it opened as a public park owned by the city of St. Paul under regulations of Metropolitan Council, which is another like quasi-state agency we have here in the Twin Cities. They oversee all of the regional parks. DNR was part of that because there's a conservation easement now on the site. So all of that to say, this is 27 acres, and this is kind of like our main work area where we're trying to care for this place. Over time, and after the site was open to the public, the folks who led the restoration thought, man, we learned a lot that we didn't know about this place. And this is really important, like St. Paul history, Minnesota history, just history that nobody was taught. We never knew this. And we live here, we grew up here, our families are from here. So they thought, well, we should build an interpretive center to help share this history. So that's where that work started happening. These are some images of our first kind of like, I think this was like our very first convening of our steering committee. So ultimately between 2005 and 2015, 16, 17, around that time, the organization really worked to try to gain build some relationships with tribal communities. So when they were talking earlier, the Historical Society and Cheyenne and Lower Sioux, and they were talking about how long those relationships takes to build, it takes a long time to build those relationships. And unfortunately, as the non-native kind of partner in that, when missteps are made, and it can set things back, because then it's like, okay, we want to trust you, we want to go into this relationship with you, but look what you guys just did. That doesn't feel right to me, and now we disengage. And so there's like a necessity on the part of the institution that wants to engage Native people to persist and to own up to those mistakes. And so that's what Lower Phelan Creek Project had to do for many years to get to the point that we got to. But ultimately made a good decision, I would say, to actually turn the organization over to Native leadership so that this project could be completed. It just wasn't happening under the leadership of non-Native people. So I came into the organization in 2019. That's me in the black. Also, it wasn't 20 years ago, but probably 20 pounds lighter, just looking cute. So I'll turn it over to Sam, and he can talk a little bit about our process, engaging our steering committee.
Yes, so it's not advancing. Hold on a second. There we go. So right about at the same time Maggie took leadership of the organization, there was an RFP for architects. And so part of what we don't always talk about in land issues is actually how do you actually do it? And I'm going to make a little plug to all my Native architect friends across the country in your communities at the end of all this, if I may. But our process was, as an Indigenous designer, was to, again, listen. And that's the first whole part of it, is the Maggie's group, the steering committee, other folks in the community who knew this site well, all had a commitment to make this a Dakota-led project, which meant it had to be a Dakota-led design. And so we looked at everything from cultural influences to relationships to the landscape, to understanding its historical importance as a sacred place. What are the activities that are going to happen there? And then how can the land use and the planning of the site and a building support all those efforts? And again, giving that authorship to the community to say what are the different things about the design, what's important about the place, what are different opportunities to express culture through design, and again, programming was important. So the design team started looking at the site. We wanted to bring the building as far away from the cave as possible to keep it on the side of the infrastructure that was there. When I'll fast forward, you can see some of the images of the site, but there's a big highway next to it. We're stuck in this corner between these railroads and infrastructure and a giant bridge. And so how do you create a place that has a sense of culture and nature within all that context? We looked at different ways of utilizing the site, plantings, cultural spaces on the outdoors, the paths, the interpretive planning, all to create a place where people could gather and again live culture, and not necessarily, show artifacts of a past, but really to say that Dakota people are here. We're in this community. This is an important place. It still remains an important place, and it will always remain an important place. And so the community helped us design and give shape to this building. Some of the early sketches, again, reflected those ideas of that relationship between land, relationship between aesthetics and visual, because cultural identity is a really important piece of this. So how do you come to a place and understand that you've just entered a very sacred place, and it doesn't want to look like anything that's ever been done before. One of the elders in our engagement said, I want this to look like nothing that I've ever seen before. And I think that's what design calls for, and design as a cultural act calls for. So these are our first initial sketches of the building. Now, we started this sort of right before the pandemic. We did a lot of design work, and what happened is construction prices went crazy, and so we went through, I think, 3 or 4 bidding processes. And each time we cut space out of the building, the price went up, and that's just the way the world worked. So a couple redesigns later, we have a smaller facility, but it does hold all of the key elements of what we wanted to do. That sense of place, that sense of entry, having a building that's sustainable and light on the land so that we're not really impacting it, because we're building in a very constricted site within a nature sanctuary. So there's a whole lot of effort we did to try to minimize that impact on the water, on the plants, and all those things. So in the end, we still have a beautiful building. You can see how you enter the site. There's that big kind of looming bridge, but that bridge almost marks like this threshold as you're parking, and once you go underneath this threshold, you're kind of leaving the city behind, and it creates that sense of a building that's small and it's modest in nature. It is a simple form that draws from the colors of the cliffs, and it draws from the kind of shapes and patterns of the forest that's there. But to really create this building that nestles itself into the landscape and doesn't impose itself as this big building. So we really wanted to have that sense of integration into the landscape. Large windows, openings to the landscape. The building is oriented in the direction of the cave. While you're in the building, unlike this room, you're going to see beautiful, expansive views of what's in the landscape, and it serves as a place for those types of gatherings, those classes, and maybe you want to talk about some of the programming that happens afterwards. And then one of the key things of all this was, like, how do you elevate that discussion through the interpretive planning, not just the building, not just the site and planning of it, but what are the signs and what are the messaging that happens? Do you want me to keep talking, or do you want to? And a lot of it has to, like, who is the authors? We worked really closely with some other designers and groups to really get the authorship of the Dakota community to say what's important here.
Right. So that beautiful building that Sam designed that you just saw was designed with the feedback of this steering committee that I talked about. So it was a committee of about a dozen Dakota people. This is a I don't want to say mistake, but it's something that is pretty common with larger institutions. If when you want to engage the indigenous community, you find maybe like one representative to sit on a group or whatever, and then there's the one voice of the Native community, right? So we are not a monolith. Recently, our sister city over in Minneapolis did a process to rename a park in the Dakota language, and worked with a group of Ojibwe people to do that renaming. And when the Dakota name that was chosen for the park was kind of like shared, like, this is what we're going to rename the park in Dakota, everybody, all the Dakota people I know, we were like, what? Why would you name it that? That doesn't even make any sense. What is happening? And so, and then, we realized that, that's how that happened. They worked with people who were easy to work with because they were in the community. They were right there, and they were well-meaning relatives, but it didn't work out. So we really wanted to avoid that. So we put together a steering committee of representative Dakota people representing. So we had seats that were designated for the representatives from the 4 Dakota, federally recognized Dakota communities in Minnesota. All had a seat at the table in this process. And we also expanded that table to other Dakota people from the diaspora. So like I mentioned earlier, Dakota after the war, and Dakota people were exiled from the state. There are a lot of people who are currently living in reservations in North Dakota and South Dakota and Canada and other places who these are their homelands, And so how do we engage those people from those communities in telling this story? So that was the committee that we made up, was about a dozen people. These are folks who are cultural resource managers, historians, authors, artists, storytellers, knowledge keepers. So it was a really, really diverse and dynamic group of folks. And so not only did they inform and influence the entire design of the building, but they also informed our interpretive planning, all of our exhibits, and even wrote the content from the community. They wrote the content for the exhibits on many of them. So these are some of those, and the photos are from the site and from community members working at this place. I don't know, Ben, if you wanted to talk a little bit. Ben's our curator and interpretive programs manager, and so I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the exhibits and.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. I'm Ben Gessner. I was going to do my Dakota introduction and look at Kate. Hamidakiapi, Shmashmawichasha Makiapido. That means good morning, relatives. And my Dakota relatives call me the man who's covered in hair. It's the same name for a peach, right? Like Fuzzy. That's my name. Okay. Hairy guy. And it's also one of the names for Bigfoot or Sasquatch, I think, too. Before I get going, I've been taking notes all morning. I'm so honored to just be part of this conversation, and I have so much admiration for so many people in the room here. And I think, as we're going, we're talking about all these technical things. And we're talking about celebrating all this work that got done. And I think some of the unspoken or between the lines kind of stuff in here is all of the emotional and spiritual labor that goes into this. And every time you do, especially the native women who are in the room here, Maggie and Cheyenne, Amber and Kate, and everybody that I know that works in this field. I work a lot with repatriation. I've worked with sacred site management. The burden is often on the community to say these things are important to us. We have to prove it over and over and over again. It's just a tremendous amount of emotional and spiritual burden and weight that I think people carry. So some of the strongest people that I've ever met are in this room right now. So I was planning on kind of facilitating a little bit of this conversation, not necessarily presenting. I'll do my best. It was really important for the steering committee to be really light on the landscape. And also to reference, but not copy, some of the pictographs and petroglyphs that were at this site. And so most of the exhibit features are up near the building, including medicine gardens, teaching gardens, a lot of native landscapes, plant interpretation. We have what are called teaching stones. So this is some of the natural limestone that comes from this site that'll be slightly etched with these traditional Dakota water designs and star designs. And this site...
And I think I should say too that the limestone, the steering committee was really adamant, and I'm glad for this, but that we not quarry for this. So we went to Ben did, and he got to wear a hard hat and a vest and everything, and he went and found some salvage limestone. And so they were like, "Are you sure you don't want quarried? Because it's a new building and it's going to look a little bit worn and weathered if it's used or from the salvage yard." But we didn't want to do that. We didn't want to be part of the continued where we could. So I just wanted to say that.
That's important. Thank you. The site itself is really like Maggie said. It's cyclical. It's about life and death. A lot of that ceremony related to life and death happened there, and it's related to the water and the stars and even the mounds. The base of the mounds. Some of those mounds are sand that was brought up from the river to the top of the bluff. So there's this connection between the stars and the water that's really important at the site, and it's very subtle in some of these design features throughout. So these are the teaching stones. We have about 7 of them throughout the site that will have audio posts, and each audio post will feature an elder, a community person, a recording of them speaking about a traditional value or story, sometimes related to the land, the water, the different animals. We should say too, Maggie might mention this later, but the more that the site is cared for, the more it's giving care back, I think, to the community. And there's so many, our bird surveys from last spring, I think 45 species of birds counted down there. And this is a really industrial, sort of surrounded by industry, but the site is just alive. It's a really beautiful place. You all should come down and take a walk with us. Are there more about the... I'll go back to you.
I don't know. Is that the end of the slides, essentially? And now here we are. So this is, you can see the, tan area there. That's our building site, and that's what it looks like right now. And so we are ready to start construction on this building after, thank you, after the pandemic and just craziness, that all the craziness that went with that. But we're ready, and we're going to get started. And I think I'm going to be getting a schedule with a start date probably on Friday. So really excited that we got to this point. And so, but kind of picking back up on that thread of land back. So this building and this project to develop this building, now we're going to be moving in, right? And this entire landscape is still owned by the city of St. Paul. It's still managed by the city of St. Paul. Currently, our organization, the relationship that we have as stewards of the land is as volunteers. And so we have to go by the guidelines of the city as a volunteer. And we're not allowed to remove buckthorn from the site. We're not allowed to... or they bring in contractors to control the invasive species, and we're not allowed to have any kind of influence over that, what they decide to do there currently. And so there will be people down there, and they'll be spraying the crown vetch, some invasive species, and meanwhile they're broadcast spraying everything. And our staff has come to the office and just been, our staff and community members, I should say, just devastated that, man, did you see that lead plant that was doing so amazing out there that we've been watching for the past 2 years? They just sprayed it. Now it's dead because there was crown vetch near it, you know? And so now that we've kind of got over this hurdle of the building project, we're starting to work with the city on what does co-management look like? Why co-management? And I should also say what differentiates this project. We're a nonprofit. We're Dakota-led nonprofit. We're a Native-run nonprofit, but we're not a tribe. We're a nonprofit organization. So, how does that work? Like, what does that look like? Real quick, the gentleman who gave me the piece of gum, what? There you are. What's your name? Joe. Do you want this gum back? Can I? You sure? Because I heard gum back is like a thing right now. And I'm also kind of done with it, and it doesn't have its flavor anymore. I just kind of want to give it back. You don't want it back? Okay. All right. Well, that's a little bit what happens with land like this in an urban area in the city. It's been completely damaged, destroyed, polluted. There's all these constrictions around it. This land has a connection to Lower Sioux Indian community, but Lower Sioux Indian community is 2.5 hours away from this site. So you give the land back to this land back to Lower Sioux. What is that? How are they supposed to manage this site 2.5 hours away? The gum back, right? Like, it's not in the same condition that it was when he gave it to me. And so what is that? You know, so there's like all these like complexities when we think about land back. Again, sister city over in Minneapolis. I'm not sure nationally how much folks have heard about this Wall of Forgotten Natives in Minneapolis. But it was a really, really large homeless encampment in Minneapolis along this kind of like freeway wall, transportation wall barrier. And this was during like the pandemic, during the uprisings with George Floyd, that this kind of Wall of Forgotten Natives kind of rose up. And it was like, you know, we're going to make ourselves visible. Like, we need resources. We need support. We are here, and we're not going to hide in the bushes so that everybody's comfortable with homelessness. Like, how, like, so that's what the Wall of Forgotten Natives was about. It was a largely Native community of unhoused folks. So how does this relate? The city of Minneapolis had to work with a lot of Native organizations. Oh, wow, look at that. You got the picture of it. So that's kind of, you can see, this was the wall. A lot of unhoused folks living down there. It took a lot of agencies working together to figure out how to deal with this issue. Like, how do we house all these folks? How do we provide resources and support? And then there was all the things that come along with an unhoused encampment. There was drug use and all these other things happening at the site, and trafficking. So how do we protect the people who are here? It was a big challenge for the city of Minneapolis and the Native nonprofits in Minneapolis who work in these kind of areas. And so eventually the wall, Red Lake Nation came in. They built a, didn't you design that, Sam? You want to talk about the facility where folks moved a little?
Yeah, so Red Lake Nation is a nation that's in northern Minnesota, but they have wanted to serve their community in Minneapolis. Luckily, I had a different presentation open. And the first step was to take some property that was adjacent to this area that they had owned. They were thinking about doing a housing development. And so the city of Minneapolis and Red Lake Nation and others worked together to quickly get up what was called the Navigation Center, which is essentially just some large tents. And so we had worked for many months to figure out can we just get people safe. And literally a week after we moved everyone into these that wanted to move into these areas, it was down to like 29 below. Like literally that was the temperature in Minneapolis. So the effort of all these indigenous organizations actually like literally saved people's lives. And then once that emergency was over, we started working on an actual affordable housing project. And I don't need to give the whole lecture on this, but just thinking about culture and design, I'm going to flip through some of these things. But within a matter of a year and a half or so, we went from what you see on the right to a beautiful public housing property for them that had a clinic at its base. There's cultural spaces, there's outdoor spaces, and we transformed this little pocket that is sandwiched in this old abandoned used gum type of site and created this beautiful place where culture and housing and services all are used to serve that community.
And so I bring this up to say that it's possible, definitely work collaborating with a tribe to do a project like this and restore a place and create a space like this. There's still that strip where the wall was, and every year it kind of pops up again and people start camping there again. And so it's become like a cyclical thing since then. And now it's kind of become like this thorn a little bit for the city of Minneapolis. Like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this? Keeps happening, like homelessness isn't just going to go away because Red Lake did this amazing thing. This is an amazing project, but homelessness is bigger than one building project can solve. So it continues to happen. And so the city of Minneapolis approached some Native community partners in Minneapolis and said, well, we want to give land back. Will you take this land here? And it was the Wall of Forgotten Native. It was literally a little strip of highway land. And it's like, so the community member who came to me and was like very excited about this, opportunity, like, oh, land back, this is great. And I'm like, kind of helped him think through, like, this is actually, they're trying to get rid of a problem by giving you this ownership of this land. Now they aren't going to have to deal with anything that happens here anymore. It's going to be the responsibility of this it's a budding nonprofit, Native nonprofit. There's like 2 people that are like working on this nonprofit right now. So I'm, that's not land back, so me giving this chewed gum back isn't gum back. You know what I mean? So like it's a complicated and loaded term, like Cheyenne was saying, land back. So what does it mean? How is it meaningful? Is the tribe asking for that land back like they did with this site down at Lower Sioux? Are they approaching and saying, like, we want to take stewardship of this? So in our case, for our site, we've had some conversations with the tribes, but again, a little bit different situation, right? The land that was transferred back from the Historical Society to Lower Sioux, it was a budding tribal land. It was like right there. This land is not. It's way up in the Twin Cities. And it also is, I guess, more up for like what tribe does it go back to? Does it go back to Lower Sioux? Prairie Island also, and what about Shakopee and Upper Sioux? And what about the communities in the diaspora? What about Flandreau and Siston and Crow Creek? So it's really, it gets complicated. It gets complicated really quickly. And so right now, kind of what we've kind of figured out is the process for now is this co-management agreement between our organization and the city of St. Paul, checking in and re-engaging with tribes. Are we on the right track? Does this management plan look good? But that's kind of like where we're at in terms of taking back some form of Native leadership, some form of Native folks being able to influence access to the site, how the site is managed, and how the land is treated. So, that's just a little bit about, I guess, where we're at. We have 10 minutes left, so I think we have time for questions. Yeah.
For sharing this, Seattle Club actually just built a similar permanent supportive housing in Seattle, which I'm very excited to see actually to roll out. They finished the building last month. As you so well demonstrated, these relationships can take decades to form. And oftentimes people move institutions within those decades. And a lot of folks that have worked on stewarding these relationships came in after the development. I was wondering what that's like to inherit those relationships and to keep the project moving, even though you came in later.
Yeah. Well, in our case, and I'm looking at Kate because she's our board chair, just being subtle in the background, but she's like, a big part of this work. And so when I was hired on and then became the executive director, it was because the institution, that's the direction they were choosing to go. They were choosing to hand over that leadership. And I joined being like, heck yeah, I want to do this work, So it was not a challenge for the institution, which is our small nonprofit, to have that transition of leadership. It was more of a benefit. And oddly enough, I guess the funding community around this project was kind of holding back and waiting for something like this to happen, which I found out after I started and we started getting all these grants, and I'm like, wow, what's going on? And they're like, whoa, so much money is coming in. And then some of the program officers were saying we were waiting for Native people to take leadership of this project. And so now we're going to give you guys this grant. So that was a little bit for us how it happened, but I don't know, Cheyenne and Amber, if you guys want to talk a little bit about the project you did and it's spanning kind of leadership transitions.
I'll turn it over to Cheyenne, but I just want to answer that question because it's such an important question and it plays such a role in all of our institutions, is that idea of succession. And when folks leave, do those relationships go with them? You don't want them to go. That's the goal, right? I feel very fortunate in the role I stepped into at the Minnesota Historical Society. While things are not perfect, we really are standing on this foundation of working with Native community members since the late 80s. Kevin had mentioned the Indian Advisory Committee. I mean, that's a strong place, right? Even though there's so much work that still needs to be done, it still is this great place of comfort that you can step in. However, you still have to have those relationships, I mean, I'm Kate's successor, Dr. Bean's successor at the Historical Society, but I was fortunate that way, right? That I sort of came up through that, building those relationships. But it's something I think about right now, okay, what if I was to leave? What does that look like then? We've got people across the institution, you're hearing from Ben and other folks that have done this, but it sometimes can take, right, one person leaving. So that's what we're really trying to do, is to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? That those internal relationships exist, but it's hard.
Or one person coming on board too. I had mentioned this to our group earlier. Each of our tribal council at Lower Sioux serves a staggered term of 4 years. So every 2 years we have an election. So as the timeline that I presented to you guys, those discussions started in 2003, and so there was there was never not a point where, at least in how I identify the process, where people weren't trying to move this forward. And because of Lower Sioux's representation in this institute, whether through the Indian Advisory Committee or the personal relationships that they had with staff in the institution, these conversations continued very naturally, and sometimes they were brought in at the leadership level. Sometimes they kind of died off, and then there was a resurgence of the dialogue. So it's just a continuation. When our management agreement with MHS was created, we didn't even have a cultural department or a tribal historic preservation office. So a lot of those conversations were happening at the government leadership level, like our tribal council and the institution, and then later on, that was kind of delineated to our department or our office to oversee. But I had mentioned this to a lady I was talking to here, that we're kind of on the backs of these giants that did all this work for us and helped us get to this point. And so just acknowledging that so much, there was 2 TIPO officers before me that, put in so much work and effort, and I don't know how many directors at the Minnesota Historical Society and tribal councils before us that did a lot of work to get us to the point where we could officialize that transfer.